Sure. So are you comfortable with the host intros and all that? Okay. It's Friday, April 24th, and you're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Nardis.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm the man. I always do that. How about this? For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm a mermaid.
And I'm Adelie Ponte. Earth Week is coming to an end. And so is the year.
Scientists are hoping to repopulate the New York, New Jersey harbor.
A bomb threat forced the evacuation of the Statue of Liberty. And na. I'll hear the NPR caster hear it.
It's Friday, April 24th, and you're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Nardos Mesmer.
And I'm Adelie Ponte. Earth Week is coming to an end, and New Yorkers are finally taking composting seriously.
I really love it. I love being able to, use the food scraps that I'm not using and bring them back to the earth.
Scientists are hoping to repopulate the New York-New Jersey harbor with oysters.
Yeah, throw them out by hand. 40 million. Takes days and days and days.
New York State universities make it difficult for ex-convicts to apply for college.
Every step of the way, it becomes harder and harder and harder until you actually feel like they don't really want me here.
Also in the show, New Yorkers commemorate the Armenian genocide. Bikers' deaths are on the rise in the city, and college students talk about losing their religious faith.
But first, this news.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. A Comcast-Time Warner merger is called off after facing significant pushback from regulators who argued a deal would have created a combined entity with unprecedented power over what people watch and download. Today, Comcast announced it would drop its $45 billion bid, and multiple reports are now stating that Charter Communications is pursuing talks with Time Warner Cable. A day after expressing regret for the deaths of 2 Western hostages during U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, President Obama says reviews are underway to find out what went wrong back in January. NPR's Tamara Keefe says Obama addressed the matter during a speech to members of the intelligence community today.
President Obama was speaking at a 10th anniversary celebration for the Director of National Intelligence when his remarks turned serious.
We all grieve when any innocent life is taken. We don't take this work lightly.
National security officials and an inspector general are now looking into how it happened that a drone strike was ordered at a compound where the hostages were being held.
We're going to review what happened. We're going to identify the lessons that can be learned and any improvements and changes that can be made.
The White House press secretary said the results of these reviews may be classified. Tamara Keith, NPR News, the White House.
After 6 years as the nation's top law enforcement official, Attorney General Eric Holder says goodbye.
It is hard for me to walk away from the people who I love and who represent this institution that I love so much. But it is time.
Holder will be succeeded by Loretta Lynch, who won Senate approval yesterday. Holder's tenure is in many ways defined by efforts to reform the criminal justice system and champion civil rights, including launching an investigation that uncovered a pattern of racial bias against blacks in Ferguson. In Baltimore, where more protests are held over the death of Freddie Gray, Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake says the results of a police investigation will be turned over to prosecutors in a week. Freddie Gray suffered an unexplained spinal injury while in police custody. He died Sunday. His case is under investigation. Much of the economic evidence has pointed toward a first quarter slowdown in the U.S., but Steve Beckner of Market News International says a key March indicator shows surprising strength.
The Commerce Department says new orders for durable goods jumped 4% last month. That's a much bigger rebound in orders for higher-priced, longer-lasting manufactured products than expected. Orders were down 1.4% in February. The strength was concentrated in transportation and defense. Orders for motor vehicles and parts surged, as did orders for military and commercial aircraft. Excluding those gains, orders were virtually flat. For NPR News, I'm Steve Beckner.
Dow is up 21. This is NPR.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Ariel Richin. A bomb threat forced the evacuation of the Statue of Liberty in Ellis Island today. The FBI and NYPD helped the National Park Service clear hundreds of people from the sites. No one was hurt. Explosive experts and Park Service police are now investigating the incident. Fire officials say a boom crane accident killed a man in Midtown. It happened just before noon off 44th Street and 2nd Avenue. The FDNY says a small crane fell from a flatbed truck and pinned the man. He has not yet been identified. Governor Andrew Cuomo announced the Metropolitan Transportation Authority is on track to receive nearly $1 billion in federal loans for safety improvements. That money will be used to install systems that can automatically slow trains in case of emergency.
It is the state-of-the-art safety design for the system. Metro North and LIRR are implementing it on 1,400 rail cars and along 588 miles of track. This is a very big development.
These systems are meant to prevent a repeat of the December 2013 Metro North crash that killed 4 people in the Bronx. The MTA announced it will increase off-peak service on the 2, 7, M, and L trains. Each of those lines saw more riders last year. The L saw the most. Service is expected to expand in December. This weekend, the L is closed for maintenance from 8th Avenue in Manhattan to Lorimer Street in Brooklyn. The New York Yankees and New York Mets will face off tonight in their first meeting of the season. The Mets have won 11 straight games. With one more tonight, they'll be off to their best start in franchise history. It will be partly sunny and breezy this afternoon, lows in the 30s this evening with clear skies. This weekend we'll see sunny skies, daytime highs in the 60s. Ariel Richen, Columbia Radio News.
With the different wars in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa, immigrants are trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe in growing numbers. A lot of them don't make it. Last Sunday, as many as 900 migrants died when a ship capsized off the coast of Libya.
European Union leaders gathered yesterday in an extraordinary summit in Brussels to discuss possible solutions to the growing crisis. Eugenio Ambrosi, the director of the International Organization for Migration for the EU, he says that European migration policy has changed a lot in the last year.
While last year there was at sea an operation called Mare Nostrum and run by the Italian Navy that had as primary objective that of search and rescue of boats adrift in the Mediterranean, now we have a different operation that has replaced Mare Nostrum, run by Frontex, whose mandate, however, was mainly to control the sea border of Europe.
And basically what you're telling me is that while Mare Nostrum was trying to help people, Frontex is kind of trying to reinforce what people have been calling the European fortress.
In a way, yes, because the problem there is that the mandate of the two operations were substantially different. Now, with the new conclusion from the European Council of yesterday, discussions are ongoing here among member states in terms of how, with this increase in budget, some search and rescue activities can also be performed by the Frontex operation.
Is this like a turning point for European countries?
It probably is. The replacement of Mare Nostrum with Triton was the result of a series of different opinions among EU member states, some of which felt last year that the presence of Mare Nostrum was actually attracting migrants. Now, with the latest event, I think there has been the realization that the reason why people were trying to cross the Mediterranean was not because they were attracted by a search and rescue operation, but by the pull factor of people running away from wars or extreme poverty.
What do you think that says of Europe's ability to bring its member states together and offer a coherent policy for the EU as a community?
Well, obviously, it's never that easy to find common grounds among 28 member states that have different situation, different perception, and different condition and needs and priorities. So it is not an easy task. And I think the way to do that is to start looking at the fact that Europe as a unity, as a community of 28 states, does have an objective need of facilitating a certain level of legal migration for economic purpose.
Another thing that has been going on in the last few years in Europe is the anti-immigrant sentiment is on the rise in most countries in Europe at the moment. In the last few weeks, we've seen it in the debate around immigration in the UK ahead of the general elections next month. How do you think this anti-immigration sentiment plays into the country's unwillingness to address the problem?
I think it plays an important role because at the end, politicians do have to take into account the mood and the feeling and the perception that the electorate has. On the other hand, I think there is a responsibility to try to make sure that the perception that the public opinion has about migration is grounded on objective facts and not on emotional issue.
Thank you very much for talking to me.
You're most welcome.
Eugenio Ambrosi is the director of the International Organization for Migration Office at the European Union in Brussels. Ex-convicts who get a college degree are less likely to go back to prison. But many former prisoners encounter a big obstacle in the college application process. That's because some colleges are worried about the effects of having felons on campus.
Not all universities ask about a criminal record, but all 64 institutions in the State University of New York system do. Ariel Richen reports.
Applying to college took extra effort for Yvonne Wilson. She was convicted 3 times for selling drugs, starting in the 1980s. And her rap sheet includes dozens of arrests. She was 49 when she started applying last year, and she was nervous.
I always wanted to go back to school, but I didn't think I could because I was older and education had changed and I was feeling a little intimidated.
On the plus side, she had taken classes while she was doing time and got an associate's degree with honors from Nassau Community College, part of the State University of New York system, because she had a mark against her on her application.
Because I checked the box.
The box on the SUNY application is next to a question that reads, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" A recent study by a prison reform group suggests that nearly 2/3 of ex-cons give up because of it. That leaves just over 1,000 every year who submit applications. Wilson says checking the box opened the floodgates. The requests for information poured in.
6 reference letters.
From employers, professors, and medical professionals.
Go get fingerprinted.
Which is one of the requests that cost her money.
And I had to take her from work.
For interviews with a review committee.
You know, like the parole board.
She told the members about her crimes, and then she waited.
The process was months. It took months. Because every time I sent them something, they asked for something else.
Patricia Worth says that whole process makes some applicants just give up.
Every step of the way, it becomes harder and harder and harder until you actually feel like they don't really want me here.
Worth is an attorney for the Center for Community Alternatives to Incarceration. She was part of the team that did the study that found that 2 out of 3 ex-cons give up because of the box. But if they finish the application, they'd be just as likely to get in as anyone else. Worth has a string of adjectives she uses to describe the process.
Incredibly burdensome, sometimes impossible, and quite often demoralizing and stigmatizing.
The box has been on SUNY's application since 1998. Each of the 64 schools in the system has its own review committee, and they all implement the policy differently. An ex-con who applied to all of them would have to provide 38 different documents. Some schools ask for information on arrests that didn't lead to convictions, and some ask courts to provide information that doesn't exist because the applicant never appeared in court. Legally, the schools can't reject applicants just because they check the box, but they can if they have safety concerns. And they do, according to Paul Berger, the Deputy Commissioner for SUNY Police.
We're not talking about people with petty crimes, with misdemeanors. Felony offenses are the highest level offenses that our society has.
He says the screening also weeds out applicants who aren't ready for life on campus after prison.
College campuses are unique. There are a lot of support services, but they're not always the same kind of support that somebody who's been recently incarcerated that they might need.
The SUNY college Yvonne Wilson got into doesn't even have a campus. She's taking classes from SUNY Empire, the state's online college.
I'm not seeing anybody. I'm seeing at my house on my computer.
Robert Stewart thinks the questions the schools are asking about criminal history are nothing more than security theater.
The idea that we look like we're doing something when in fact it may not have any real tangible effect on security.
Stewart is a researcher at the University of Minnesota who's looked at applications at 1,400 four-year colleges for a study. He wants his report to bolster the conclusions that others have found, that asking questions about past convictions is worthless. But he's having a hard time finding any studies to refute because
students with prior criminal records, we don't have any data that shows that they affect campus safety at all.
SUNY says it's never studied how effective its policy is. Student Yvonne Wilson thinks the school should stop putting the box on their application. She's going to Albany next month to lobby for a bill that would force them to remove it. She prepared for that trip by role-playing with another advocate for reform. He played the role of a state senator.
Safety of private citizens that are tax-paying and they want to make sure that their children are safe on campus.
If you look at the statistics and you see what colleges have this box on their applications versus those that don't, the crime rate is no different. And a person coming home from prison that gets educated is less likely to reoffend.
A similar bill last year never made it out of committee. But Wilson is hopeful. Last fall, New York's Attorney General got 3 private colleges to stop asking applicants about arrests. Ariel Richin, Columbia Radio News.
Today marks the centennial.
Today marks the centennial anniversary of the mass killings most historians refer to as the Armenian Genocide. Up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed during the Ottoman Empire in 1915.
Many countries, including Turkey, refused to call the killings a genocide. Today, thousands of Armenians marched to the Turkish consulate in Manhattan, trying to get recognition of the century-old killings.
St. Vartan Armenian Cathedral is a massive church located on 34th Street and 2nd Avenue. It is the heart of the Armenian community in New York City. This morning, thousands gathered to attend church to remember those who died. Lisa Stepanian is the executive director of the Armenian Fund USA.
Already I have goosebumps. So it's a very special day for all Armenians all over the world.
The group was preparing to march and spend the afternoon protesting at the Turkish consulate at 3rd and 28th.
Turkey's guilty of genocide!
Demanding that Turkey recognize the genocide. Turkey has insisted for a century that the Christian Armenians and Muslim Turks killed in 1915 were victims of civil war and unrest as the Ottoman Empire collapsed during World War I. It says that there was no plan to wipe out Armenians and therefore does not add up to genocide. Howard Eisenstadt is a historian at St. Lawrence University. He says for Turkey to admit to the genocide, that would require them to rethink their own history.
When they think genocide, they think in terms of the Holocaust, they think in terms of the Nazis, they don't think in terms of the many more complicated, more muddy genocides that have also occurred. And so for them, the Armenian genocide means the Holocaust, and they don't see that.
Nawar Megherbichayan is the chair of the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party. He says Turkey's denial is an affront to a core part of their national identity.
The 50th anniversary of the genocide, the first 50 years, the survivors of the Armenian genocide were like in a coma. They really didn't do much. However, starting 1965, the 50th anniversary, we woke up and we started pursuing the cause so the world would know.
Today, only 20 nations officially recognize the Armenian genocide. The list does not include the United States, Israel, and many others who count on Turkey as an important ally in the Middle East. The White House announced on Tuesday that it does not want to use the term genocide. In 2007, when he was running for president, Barack Obama called the mass killing a genocide. But during his presidency, he has resorted to citing regional priorities in its decision not to say the killings amounted to genocide. The decision has angered many Armenians in the United States and abroad, who say they hoped President Obama would use the centennial as an opportunity to put things right. Nawar Megherbichayan.
You will see that the Armenian community are very mad with President Obama. There's a cause we are going to pursue it regardless.
This Sunday, Armenians will continue to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in Times Square. Charlotte Gibson, Columbia Radio News.
On Wednesday, Mayor de Blasio announced an ambitious plan to reduce New York City's waste output to landfills by 90% in the next 15 years. A big part of that is turning household organic waste into compost instead of sending it to the landfills.
Tyler Daniels takes a look at current composting culture in the city and what it will take to turn the mayor's trash talk into a sustainable reality.
Organics are foods and other waste items that are capable of naturally turning into soil through a process called composting. But right now, the majority of New York's food waste goes directly into the trash to rot away in landfills. New York does offer the possibility of disposing this waste in a greener manner, but this requires residents saving their eggshells, banana peels, and coffee grounds and dropping them off at a disposal site, like the one at the Green Market on West 97th Street this morning.
It's my first compost.
Greg Salwin says as he dumps his small bag of food waste into the large brown bin.
I think that reducing waste is always a good thing.
Rachel Landsberg is a composting regular. She freezes her food waste in her Upper West Side apartment so she can drop it off here.
I really love it. I love being able to, use the food scraps that I'm not using and bring them back to the earth.
But she says the city could make the process a lot easier for its residents.
I'd rather have it be done by the city and do it every few days.
And Mayor Bill de Blasio says he's trying to improve the composting system.
With composting, I think there's a lot of ways we can teach people, make it simpler, make it better. I think a lot of people, as they experience it, find it is a great thing.
On Wednesday, as part of his One NYC plan, he announced that the city will vastly expand its program, collecting household food waste and depositing it at composting sites. The goal, to reduce landfill waste by 90%.
Well, it won't be easy. They started 90% is a tremendous goal for any city.
That's Jean Bonital, the director of Cornell University's Waste Management Institute. She highlights special considerations for implementing a large-scale composting system in a city like New York.
There are too many organics in New York City for New York City to compost all of it in New York City. So there are going to have to be some ways to do it outside of the city.
The city plans to offer these services to everyone by 2018. In his announcement, Mayor de Blasio showed he takes composting personally.
I'm a composting trainer. I just get a little crazy when I see white paper in the trash can. That's one of the things that really gets me. And at Gracie Mansion, we have all the bins laid out in a row in our kitchen, and everything needs to go in the right bin.
For more information about composting in your neighborhood, New Yorkers can go to nyc.gov/organics. Tyler Daniels, Columbia Radio News. And in his announcement, the city.
There are more bikes than ever on New York City streets, and that also means more cyclists and cars struggle to share the road. 20 bicyclists died on the streets last year.
The Department of Transportation announced plans to redesign several multi-lane streets where that are a high number of collisions. In East Harlem, the struggle for safe streets raises issues of race and class, Cassandra Bassler reports.
The intersection of Park Avenue and 108th Street in East Harlem has some unusual features. On the east side, there's a public housing development and a playground. On the other side, the Metro North train rumbles over a stone viaduct. It divides Park Avenue and blocks the view of traffic coming the other way. Here, a taxi struck and killed Jerison Garcia as he rode his bike at 5 a.m. last August. Last Sunday, his cousins met with arms full of flowers at a white bicycle chained to a parking sign. Ellen Belcher greets them.
And you guys should, decorate the bike. Don't you think that would be a good idea? Okay. Yeah.
That's a ghost bike. Belcher volunteers for the street safety advocacy group that takes old bike frames, spray paints them white, and places them in memory of bicyclists killed in traffic. Today is the 10th annual memorial ride, so the Garcias weave white tulips, roses, and carnations through the spokes of the bike. There's a ceremony planned. A group of 25 memorial riders are making their way from across the city to pay their respects. The trouble is, they don't know which ghost bike to visit, because Garcia was the third bicyclist killed here since 2012.
Is this the bike or is that the bike?
Right here.
There's another bike right here.
Yeah.
So there are 3 bikes.
Wow, just a block of each other.
It's a haunting reminder of the danger these cyclists face on the streets. Belcher says a few words about the collision and invites Garcia's mother to speak. Murder, she says. Part of her frustration is that there's so few consequences for drivers who kill bike riders. The driver who hit Garcia got out on bail and may at most be sentenced to 30 days in jail. But another issue is how unsafe the intersection feels. Ollie Oliver knows that intersection well.
If you're crossing Park Avenue, you have 2 travel lanes, 2 parking lanes, and the width of the elevated train to get across in a single light cycle.
Oliver is with the advocacy group Transportation Alternatives. He says getting safer streets is a matter of increasing law enforcement, educating bicyclists and drivers on the rules of the road, and building bike paths. He says streets with bike lanes work. There are 40% fewer fatal collisions on roads that have them. But almost all bike lanes run through northern Brooklyn and below 96th Street in Manhattan. That leaves neighborhoods like East Harlem vulnerable.
There's very little on the east side. In fact, there's no real southbound route.
In that vulnerability, folks like Stephen Harvey step in. Harvey says the ghost bikes remind drivers and cyclists to be careful, even when the cops aren't watching. That's why he takes care of the memorials.
I like watch them, straighten them out. Anywhere I go, if I see one knocked on the side, I'm picking it up and standing it straight up and stuff like that. But I made promise to people and families that I will maintain the ones in my neighborhood.
Harvey rides with the group called East Harlem Cycle Squad. At the end of a day cycling to all the ghost bike memorials, he's decompressing with fellow riders at a bar in the downtown financial district. He says the lack of bike lanes and lack of law enforcement show how the city neglects issues in his community.
Me being a person of color and living in Harlem, New York, and like the whole thing, I get harassed by the cops all the time, and then the cops are really no help.
Harvey says his flashy bike is another way he keeps the young cyclists and the East Harlem Cycle Squad safe on their rides, so that they don't end up on the list of the 200 ghost bike memorials.
Like no one in my club has lights, and maybe one or two, a few people, but nobody has lights like mine to stand out enough where I could control traffic with my bike. People in cars, in motor vehicles, even pedestrians could be aware and know I'm coming.
For now, Harvey says that's the best he can do. The DOT has yet to announce plans for a southbound bike lane on Manhattan's east side. Cassandra Basler, Columbia Radio News.
Commentator Gregoire Moe went on a bike trip in Australia.
It took a broken bicycle chain for him to appreciate how friendly Australians are and to realize how far our fellow French people had to go to catch up.
That day, my friend Rodolfo and I loaded up our sleeping bags and went off by bike to the hot springs. Rodolfo had already been to the springs, and he could not be more enthusiastic, telling me how relaxing it was to get into these warm pools of water. Definitely worth a 50-mile bike ride, he told me. It was cloudy when we left. We biked along the sea, the wind blowing in our face. Rodolfo seemed to ride effortlessly, and I was wishing I had spent more time at the gym. About halfway there, in the middle of a highway, my bike chain broke. It was 5 p.m. on a Saturday, and all the bike stores were closing. We were about to start a miserable walk to the closest city when a car pulled over. Inside was a couple and a young child. They offered to take us to the city. They even drove us to 2 hardware stores, hoping we'd find a new chain. No luck. The man who gave us the ride said, "Let me call my friend." And it turned out his friend had a bike he wasn't using much, and he was willing to break his own chain to repair mine. After offering us a beer, obviously. Aussie hospitality, mate. Legend has it that Australians are nice, but this couple took it to a whole other level. And there may be some truth to the stereotype. I recently found out there is something called the World Giving Index. It's kind of a good guy indicator. It ranks countries based on how often their citizens help strangers, volunteer, and give money to charities. Australia is usually in the top 10. United States ranks first. But I am French, and France ranked near the bottom. Even Google shames us. When you start typing "why are French" in the search bar, Google suggests that you ask why are French so rude. And that's something I heard a lot. I didn't really get it before going to Australia. I thought we were just a bit proud. Back in the day, we used to be a superpower, sacre bleu. So obviously, if you're a tourist, don't bother trying to say a few words in French when asking for directions. Chances are we won't stop to help. Plus, we have work to do while you're enjoying your holiday, okay? Oh wait, maybe we are kind of rude. Back to Australia, I experienced a very different mindset. This Australian couple who picked my friend and me up, it was past 7 p.m. when we were done repairing my bike. Night was falling, so they drove us almost 30 miles to the camp where we wanted to rest. And they gave us their business card just in case we encountered any trouble when coming back from the hot springs. We asked them, "What were you up to today before you picked us up?" They said they were on their way to the beach with their young child. It was supposed to be their first family trip since he was born. It became an afternoon with a couple of helpless foreigners instead.
Greg Rameau promises to speak English to tourists back home, but he'll proudly use his outrageous French accent.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Adelie Ponte.
And I'm Nardos Mesmer. Uptown Radio is online at uptownradio.org. You can also listen to us on air at WBAI-FM every Monday at 5 a.m. Here's what's coming up.
Mayor de Blasio could allow public schools to rent out space for church worship.
We report on efforts to bring oysters back to the waters around New York City.
And we'll meet Caesar, the human-like robot designed to help kids with autism.
All that and more to come, but first, the news.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Hannah Klingberg. The National Park Service says everyone is safe after a bomb threat led to the evacuation of the Statue of Liberty earlier today. Visitors and personnel were taken from the site by ferry, and explosives experts searched the island along with the Park Service police. The proposed $45 billion merger between Comcast and Time Warner Cable is off, and regulators say this is a victory for consumers. Joe Sykes reports.
If you've ever gotten a cable bill, you know they can be expensive. With this in mind, federal regulators decided to challenge a deal that would have created the largest cable company in the history of the industry. They believe Comcast and Time Warner would wield too much control over consumers in this internet age. After the Justice Department expressed their concerns to Comcast this week, they decided to drop the deal. It's a spectacular collapse for one of the biggest mergers in the history of media. But Comcast Chief Executive Brian Roberts told CNBC this morning, that's life.
We thought we could get the deal approved. We thought we could make a good case. But in the end, we got to move on.
The move could mean a new phase in the relationship between regulators and big media. In 2011, they approved a merger between Comcast and NBC Universal. Now they're showing a bit more concern about consumer choice and those expensive cable bills. Joe Sykes, Columbia Radio News.
The Obama administration is revising how it communicates with the families of hostages. Yesterday, President Obama apologized and took responsibility for the deaths of 2 hostages who were killed in a U.S. drone strike in January. White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said the administration is considering bringing together different agencies to better coordinate rescue efforts and improve contact with hostage families.
There is a premium on clear, direct, specific, regular, reliable communication with these families, and that can be difficult when you have a wide range of agencies that are involved.
Earnest said that improved communication will not change the United States policy never to offer ransom. Actress Angelina Jolie met with the UN Security Council today. She's asking it to help the millions of Syrian refugees. She criticized the council's efforts in the area so far.
The Security Council has powers to address these threats to international peace and security, but those powers lie unused.
Jolie wants the foreign ministers of the Council of Nations to come together to negotiate a political solution in Syria. Nearly 4 million refugees have fled the country since the beginning of its civil war in 2011. Leaders around the world are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the massacre of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire today. An estimated 1.5 million Armenians were killed by Ottoman Turks. The massacre is widely viewed as historians as the first act of genocide in the 21st century, but modern Turkey, the successor to the Ottoman Empire, rejects the charge. Hannah Klingberg, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Nardos Mesmer.
As you heard in our newscast, President Barack Obama apologized yesterday for a U.S. counterterrorism operation that accidentally killed 1 American and 1 Italian on the Afghanistan and Pakistan border region. The 2 men were being held hostage at an al-Qaeda compound.
And we do believe that the operation did take out dangerous members of al-Qaeda. What we did not know, tragically, is that al-Qaeda was hiding the presence of Warren and Giovanni in this same compound.
The administration is now conducting reviews of the drone strikes to determine what went wrong. Steve Cole, Dean of Columbia Journalism School, wrote about the drone use in The New Yorker. He said the drone system designed by the United States was supposed to eliminate these types of mistakes.
So in making this announcement yesterday, I think it was especially painful for the president because
Here was a mistake that had occurred under this new system where there weren't supposed to be mistakes of this type. Obama inherited this, and he decided to keep it going and actually to increase it. So the number of attacks grew and grew and grew. And the idea that drones could be very discriminating became called into question for good reason, because the drones started to look more like a conventional air war than a precise, targeted machine. And in May 2013, he announced new standards for the use of drone strikes. And he said that they would only strike if there was a near certainty, that was the phrase, a near certainty that there would be no civilian casualties.
Is that what makes the deaths of these two hostages so different from the others? Is that they died under this new revised program for drones?
Yeah, I think there are two things that are very tragic about this mistake. One, they left Warren Weinstein behind, basically, and then he dies in these circumstances. And then to have it happen under the rules that are supposed to prevent any civilian, American, Pakistani, or Afghan, from being killed in these strikes is doubly tragic. So I think it basically raises a question that the president, I think, will be called upon to answer in greater detail than he did yesterday, which is whether these rules that he thought were almost foolproof really are reliable.
So does the fact that underneath these new rules this incident happened anyway, does that change the ethics of war in any way?
There are some thinkers who have made the point that the kind of cost-free aspect of a drone is actually an incentive to have more war, because you can go shoot at people with much less risk to yourself. And so what it may mean is that these machines are better at sparing innocents from strike to strike, but they ultimately create more war.
Do you think that this sets a new precedent in terms of the counterterrorism operations?
In Pakistan, because these are secret and we don't even admit that they're going on, all these families are affected and they get no satisfaction, they have no redress, and the United States doesn't even admit it's responsible. So here we've killed a couple of Western civilians, an American and an Italian, and we're prepared to apologize and take responsibility for the accident. But in all these other cases, we pretend as if nothing happened. I don't think that's a sustainable foreign policy.
Okay, thank you so
very much.
Steve Cole is the Dean of Columbia University's Journalism School and a staff writer at The New Yorker.
The Uberification of food delivery is a crowded market, and entrepreneurs are getting increasingly creative. With the push of a button, you can order beer, get a freshly baked cookie delivered in under 20 minutes, or score some pot.
With the glut of delivery and on-demand apps, not all of them are going to make it. Hava Guerreri reports on what on-demand apps are doing to stay ahead of the curve.
Delivery startups keep starting up and getting funded. In the last month alone, 3 startups, DoorDash, OnFleet, and Sprig, raised $87 million in venture capital. Big players like Amazon, Google, Uber, and Starbucks are also getting in the game. Delivery apps offer a solution to a problem you may not have even known you had, like Drizzly, which was one of the first apps to offer alcohol delivery. Nick Reyes, Drizzly's CEO, says it all started when he and his friends were in college in Boston.
This is back in 2010, 2011. It was a late night, empty fridge. I sent my co-founder Justin a text message. I said, "Why can't you get alcohol delivered like an Uber car?"
Why indeed? Reyes and his friends went to find out.
The first thing we did was we actually walked into liquor stores and we pitched them on the idea and we asked them, their thoughts and their reception. And overwhelmingly in Boston, there was a negative reception. And there are a lot of reasons for that.
The problem was fake IDs. Liquor stores can lose their license if they sell to someone who is underage.
We partnered with a company that's considered the gold standard of ID verification. We took their system and brought it mobile. It's a system that looks into the forensic features of an ID. It's going to make sure your ID is real. It's going to make sure it's not expired. It's going to make sure you're over 21.
Today, they've expanded to 14 cities. Delivery apps like Drizzly are middlemen. They connect customers with restaurants and restaurants with messengers. A lot of that relies on data. Companies like Delivery.com have a lot of data on restaurants, their locations, hours, menu items, prices, etc. That allows customers to filter by location, rating, and all the other features we now expect. Tim O'Reilly, the VP of Technology at Delivery.com, says they use an algorithm to recommend dishes to customers.
We store the contents of users' orders, and we can tell what dishes are popular based off those orders.
For most people, popular just means what's ordered the most often.
We look at what users order and then tend to order again.
So they can discover new dishes. For example,
pad thai is going to be a popular dish at any Thai restaurant because a lot of people order pad thai.
Because it's a go-to dish. But
you might not know that this Thai restaurant has this other dish
that people who go there really love. These recommendation algorithms are useful because established apps like Seamless give so much choice that it can be hard to choose. Caspia Schwartz is a Barnard student. She orders food in with her boyfriend on Monday nights.
We put on a movie, order the food, watch the movie until the food comes, then eat the food while we finish the movie. That's a routine of ours.
Schwartz says she likes to use Seamless because of its filters.
Just I filter by best or highest reviews and then pick from one of them, because it's better to filter through that than to just find sushi places or Mexican, because there's so many places.
Delivery.com makes their data available for free with something called an API. They want other app makers to use their data and their infrastructure to build their own apps. Basque is a startup that uses the API.
People are trying to eat healthy, so this Go Basque company has tried to kind of tackle that challenge of, given all this data, what are the healthiest dishes?
Basque will also recommend food for specific diets, say paleo or vegan or vegetarian. Other companies like Seamless and Postmates also make their data free. They all want to be the mothership of specialty delivery apps, so they become indispensable to the industry. Right now, there's probably some college kids out there figuring out how to turn their laziness into a startup. But if they're going to succeed, they better have some technological mutation that gives them an advantage over the competition. Chava Garari, Columbia Radio News.
We have two pieces about challenges that religion faces in the United States.
New York City schools can rent out space on the weekends, but not to churches who want to hold religious services. School regulations prohibit it. The city and church groups have been battling this issue for more than 20 years. In the last development, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal that would rule on this issue.
That means that in New York City, it's up to Mayor de Blasio who could allow it. Schools can use the money and small congregations need the space. And, as Teresa Avila reports, for several small churches, the future of their congregation is at stake.
Melissa Suarez has just finished passing out Ritz crackers to a handful of toddlers at a public school on Avenue D in the East Village. She's already read them the story of Genesis, but she's starting again from the beginning.
He called the light day and he called the darkness night. This was the end of the very first day. Then God said,
It's not a typical lesson inside a public school, but this is a Sunday, and between the hours of 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., this school is home to Abounding Grace Ministries. Schools regularly earn money from renting their spaces during off hours to outside groups. But when it comes to religious worship in schools, the city has the authority to kick out the churches. Jordan Lawrence is an attorney who has represented the Bronx Household of Faith since 1994. That's when the small evangelical church sued the city for the right to worship in schools.
I want to make sure the policy doesn't treat religious groups differently than other groups that are meeting in the public schools.
It comes down to how you interpret the First Amendment, which covers both separation of church and state and free speech. Church leaders say it's a free speech issue. They should have the same access to schools as secular groups. And of the top 50 school districts in the nation, New York City is the only one to specifically bar outside groups from renting schools for worship.
The mere presence of a private religious organization in a building run by the government somehow is a violation of the Establishment Clause. New York City just viewed this as it looked bad.
Looked bad because it could look like the city endorses a religion. That's the issue of separation of church and state. Jack Roberts is the co-pastor for the Bronx Household of Faith, which sued the city. He says the average person understands that renting a space for a church is not the same as establishing a church.
Nobody in our neighborhood thinks that that's a church building over there because we rented it for Sundays for 12 years. Nobody. They didn't even know we were there, most likely. There aren't signs saying this is the Bronx Household of Faith. There's no way to identify that.
When the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case last month, the issue was punted back to Mayor de Blasio. About 70 New York City schools are rented by churches, usually very small ones that can't afford a permanent space. Roberts again.
It wasn't that we could have gone across the street and rented the Marriott or something. That just wasn't, that's not happening here.
The Bronx Household of Faith moved into its own place last year. It's just across the street from PS 15, the school they rented for more than a decade and still rent for holidays like Easter. The mayor has the legal right to kick out the churches from the schools, but he's indicated a willingness to find a way for them to stay. That wasn't always the case. A few years ago, under Mayor Bloomberg, the city had ordered the churches to exit the schools, following a victory in court. But the legal challenges created a constant level of uncertainty for churches. Karen Marriott is a pastor for the Lower Manhattan Community Church in Tribeca, which used to rent PS 89.
If you can't be in a stable place where people can find you on a weekly basis, it compromises your ability to serve them.
Instead of waiting for a favorable court decision, her church looked elsewhere for a space, and they found one, not in a school. Now they pay a rate almost 5 times the previous one.
We were blessed enough to be able to find another space that's wonderful and beautiful and meets all of our needs, but not every church is going to be able to do that.
Take Abounding Grace Ministries. They're still inside PS 34. Before people arrive for Sunday worship, volunteers are working to make the school auditorium look like a church. The choir warms up to a portable keyboard in lieu of a piano. For a personal touch, Diana Del Rio sets up branches and candles at the foot of the stage in the school's auditorium. She says they've learned how to make do.
Would be nice if we had a space and we wouldn't have to set up from scratch every week, but we got to do what we got to do. So we make it look as much like a church as possible, or as much like a serene space.
To dim the lights for the right ambiance, she has to unplug each light socket by socket. Before things get rolling, she takes a step back.
I just make sure it just looks really neat and welcoming. That's the most important thing.
Welcoming will be up to Mayor de Blasio. If the mayor changes the school policy, dozens of churches like this will be able to continue their services without worry. Teresa Avila, Columbia Radio News.
The other challenge that religion faces is more personal. Americans without any organized religion are called nuns, but not the Catholic kind. They're called nuns because they mark none when asked which religion they belong to. A Pew Center study shows that Asian Americans are becoming nuns faster than any other racial or ethnic group.
And Anjali Sastry reports that it's in the college years that many people abandon their faith.
Hundreds of students are congregating on the steps of Columbia University's Low Library on a sunny afternoon for a mock South Asian wedding. This is an annual celebration called Hangama. The event is religious, but many students attending are not. Columbia senior Chaitanya Kanetkar doesn't partake in religious rituals, but he performs at campus events like these because he's part of a group of Bhangra dancers. Bhangra is an ancient religious folk dance from India.
Next up, make some noise for CU Bhangra.
Kanetkar went to a Hindu school when he was a kid, and he still performs a religious dance, but he isn't religious.
Dancing Bhangra with the Bhangra team is it's more cultural than it is religious than anything.
Kanetkar is a nun. A recent Pew Center study defines nuns as people who might engage in activities like prayer or religious dance. But they don't do much more than that. Many Americans who become nuns do so when they're in college. Some of them take the chance to try things their religion prohibits and decide they like it. Kanetkar ate chicken for the first time in his life last summer. Some ultra-Orthodox forms of Hinduism ban eating chicken. But Kanetkar liked eating chicken, which was evidence that his feelings about religion were changing.
I would just say at college I became even more spiritual and less religious.
Even though he doesn't identify as Hindu anymore, Kanetkar goes to weekly prayer service on campus because he wants to be part of a community.
There's a Hindu students organization here that I occasionally go to the Friday prayers, and I really enjoy that experience because it kind of reminds me of that, like, this very collective family gathering that I had at home.
Georgia State University professor Brett Isaki studies why ethnic minorities have become less religious. He says Kanetkar is doing what a lot of Asian Americans do when they get to college.
Many quickly find that a religious affiliation distinguishes them. If you can distinguish yourself, say, for example, as an evangelical Christian, there are many other evangelical Christians who are Asian or of other backgrounds who would fully accept you as a member of them.
But Isaki says that doesn't work for everybody.
However, if you're not binding with these other groups, you find yourself often targeted for your different religious backgrounds.
That was the case for NYU freshman Brian Young, who is Chinese American. About a third of nuns like Young are already that way by the time they get to college. Young became a nun during his sophomore year of high school when his parents got divorced. That same year, he came out as gay, and he stopped referring to himself as a Catholic. Young took issue with the Catholic Church's position on gay marriage. Then he started questioning other things about it.
And so as a result, the viewpoint is very much brushing aside that issue in a way. And so I really just didn't like that dismissal. And so from there, I started really hammering in on a lot of the social statements that the church had made.
That caused tension with his mom, who kept asking him why he left the church.
Almost, how could you just abandon something like that that's been there for so long and that you did have a connection with at some point?
When Young got to NYU, he didn't feel like he had a connection to anything. But a few months into his freshman year, he found his community and some new friends at the Global Spiritual Fellowship on campus. Georgia State's Brett Isaki says Young's need to experience other cultures is what many Asian Americans who become nuns do to fit in.
What my research has discovered is that spiritual but not religious and religious nuns actually enables Asian Americans to embed themselves into multiple cultures at the same time.
Young might not see himself as a Catholic anymore, but he still goes to church with his mom every Sunday when he's back home.
And I, a little begrudgingly, go with her whenever I'm home. But sometimes she'll joke with me and she'll be like, I prayed for you, or like, I keep hoping that you'll come back.
And once Young returns to NYU from summer vacation, his plan is to help other students overcome issues with religion. Anjali Sastry, Columbia Radio News.
Adelie, what images come to mind when I say 3D printing?
Little colorful plastic figurines of dinosaurs and Darth Vader, I guess.
Well, the technology has become a little more advanced. Artists all over the world have embraced 3D printing as a new medium. Hannah Klingberg reports that 3D printers are becoming a new medium to create fine arts.
I'm standing next to Canadian sculptor James Stewart. He's displaying his first printed piece at this year's 3D print show in Chelsea.
I have a 3D printed, hand-sculpted, colored print sculpture.
The sculpture is called Jerry. It's a 16-inch model of a Brazilian dancer crouching in a low squat, his long outstretched arms resting on his knees. Shiny and white, with brightly colored images on the surface, the sculpture looks just like painted porcelain.
What's great about this piece right now is it does have that not printed look, which is very important for the future of the medium if you wanted to maintain a higher-end look.
From afar, the images on the surface look like tattoos, but up close you realize that it's a collage of famous photographs and drawings. There's a piece of a Monet on the back and a little Mickey Mouse drawing right next to it. Stewart says the printed sculpture allows him to say more than he could with his traditional bronze work.
I do want to just raise awareness of sort of the human condition and just generally our views on what art is, our influences, and I try to put those onto the surface.
Today's professional 3D printers can handle over 50 different materials, including metals, even gold. The sculpture Jerry is printed in what's called sandstone. That's the only material that lets you print images in full color on the surface. Many artists have their sculptures printed in the Advanced Media Lab at New York University.
You can kind of see that, I'll just lift the lid really quickly. This is the bed where the prints get set.
Demaray Ford shows me how sandstone printing works.
So you can see that it's just a really fine grain powder that gets layered on top of each other with a binder in between each layer, which is essentially the same thing as glue. It's basically Elmer's glue with ink in it.
The printer has just finished a piece by the artist Josh Klein for his new exhibition at the Whitney Museum. Ford picks up what looks like a flat, dusty brick from the print bed.
And you can kind of see that when we dig these out of the printer, they're all covered in a really light, a thin film of powder that we then have to clean off the parts. They then are treated with a post-processing that makes the colors come out and also makes the parts stronger.
James Stewart's sculpture Jerry took nearly 24 hours and cost $5,000 to print. But first, Stewart spent 2 months making a clay model of the sculpture, just like he would with a traditional bronze piece. Though he didn't have to.
You can do the same thing through a computer, frankly. A beautiful sculpture on a computer is still a beautiful sculpture. But that master's touch, when you're using your fingerprints, I think it retains a certain energy.
He then scanned the clay model using a high-resolution 3D scanner before adding the artwork on the surface. He points to an area around Jerry's shoulder.
There's fingerprints all over this guy. Everything has been made with a fingerprint. I don't use tools.
After scanning the model, Stewart had to digitally cut the sculpture into pieces. Because, he says, the main problem with 3D printers is size.
If you want to make something 16 inches high, you can't. The biggest the printer is about 10 inches high. So my sculpture being 16 inches, I had to break it into pieces and sort of almost fuse them together.
But that was last year when he printed Jerry. Since then, a lot has happened with the technology. Now there are printers that can handle pieces up to 40 inches tall. Stewart says there's another issue with 3D printed fine art, and that's replicating the work. Unlike traditional sculpting, where the mold deteriorates with use, 3D printing allows Stewart to make as many identical copies as he wants. But in order to sell them as original artwork, he will limit the number.
I'm just going to do 9 of them, and when that's done, I'll destroy the files, and we're done.
So far, he's only printed the one, and he hasn't sold it yet. Stefania Bordolami is the owner of Bordolami Gallery in Chelsea. She's sold several works of art with 3D printed pieces. She says just 3 years ago, it was seen as a novelty.
Like, it was a thing in itself. It would be like, oh, the artist uses 3D printing.
But now, Bordolami says 3D printing has become another medium, one we'll see more of in fine art.
We're just at the beginning, so it will become more and more sophisticated, using different type of materials in order to create the 3D prints. It's already pretty normal, but it will become more and more the norm.
And with the technology developing at full speed, that day might come sooner than we think. Hannah Klingberg, Columbia Radio News.
And you can see images of James Stewart's sculpture on our website, uptownradio.org.
The New York University School of Engineering has developed technology designed to help kids with learning disabilities and medical problems.
Dasha Lisitsina went to an exhibition in Brooklyn to meet Caesar, the humanoid robot, who mimics your facial expressions and plays Carb Crush, a video game that measures your blood sugar levels.
Caesar, the humanoid robot, doesn't look very human. He's just a white plastic head with big googly eyes, horizontal blocks for eyebrows, and a wire for a mouth. When a guy called Khaled meets Caesar, he smiles. Caesar smiles back. He frowns. Caesar's eyebrows turn inwards and his mouth makes an inverted U shape. Caesar's facial expressions are a textbook study in cartoon emotion.
It looks like someone walked in, but they shouldn't be there.
He's there because he's designed to help autistic children express and recognize emotion, according to one of his makers, Jared Frank.
So that a teacher or a student can practice showing different emotions by interacting with the robot and having the robot mimic it.
Caesar is built on the same software most smartphones and applications used to detect faces. All of his internal mechanisms came out of 3D printers, which means he'll be relatively cheap to replicate. Frank explains that autistic children have trouble communicating with other humans. but they're perfectly comfortable hanging out with robots.
Some of these activities can be very fun, like for these children, like going through different case scenarios, like you give a new toy to the child. When the child enjoys it, you practice happiness and you express it back and forth with the robot.
All kids, whether or not on the autism spectrum, learn a lot faster through playing games. That's why Eddie Melser and his partner have developed a game to help diabetic children manage their own diet by controlling their sugar intake. It's called Carb Crush. Think of it as the healthy version of Candy Crush. It looks similar too. Melser helped me give it a go.
You'll see these food falling and you'll want to eat different types. So you just ate an orange juice. There you go. And now your blood sugar's back in the normal level range.
I am actually gulping down digital fruits by opening and closing my analog mouth as the game registers this.
So how am I doing so far?
You're actually doing very well. You were normal right now, but you're getting a little low. So an apple would be really good, or the fruit juice over there.
This is called simulated learning. Melser says kids learn better from playing video games than they do reading instruction manuals.
When you do things with your body, it's a lot easier to understand and learn through a kinesthetic way. So this type of approach where you actually embody the act of eating and physically move around may make it easier and more accessible and make more sense to kids if you actually relate it to a real life action.
NYU organises this show annually to exhibit their students' work to prospective buyers and curious members of the public. Diabetic kids are testing Carb Crush right now, and Caesar the robot is about to start working with autistic kids. Dasha Lisitsina, Columbia Radio News.
Springtime means the birds are chirping and tulips are opening. And deep under the swampy muck in New York's waters, oysters are waking up.
These small animals do a big service to the environment. They filter billions of gallons of water each day. Soon there could be more of them in the New York-New Jersey harbor. Paula Lem started her oyster journey on Long Island.
The road to Great Atlantic Shellfish Farms takes me out of East Islip along Bayview Avenue, through quiet houses and past the marina. I ignore the do not enter signs and drive through a forest of tall reeds. The pavement turns to gravel. Minutes later, I wind up at a small blue hut at the water's edge. This is the largest shellfish hatchery on the south shore of Long Island. Doug Winter owns the place.
You got your boots?
Yes. There are dozens of cages next to the building. It's windy, and spray off the Great South Bay hits us as we talk.
This whole bay used to be the biggest oyster producing spot in the country, and that's basically what we're bringing back.
Winter took over the hatchery from the city 3 years ago. It's a commercial hatchery now. Mark Burns, the manager, has been here since the late 1980s. In his office, the windowsills are covered with shells.
This used to be a bathhouse that the town was going to eliminate, destroy. So I started knocking down walls and building a hatchery.
The town of Islip hired him. His job? To rebuild the decimated shellfish population.
The bay was overharvested, so when you run the population down so much, Mother Nature can't keep up.
The bay is 45 miles long, tucked under the bottom fin of Long Island's fish-like profile. Up until the 1920s, the oyster business here thrived. In fact, the bay is home to the original Blue Point.
Blue Point oysters is a famous oyster. You can look on the menu now and see a Blue Point oyster, but unless it's grown in Great South Bay, it's not a Blue Point.
Every year, this hatchery grows up to 40 million baby oysters. Burns and his crew scatter them in the bay as part of environmental efforts to bring their levels up.
Yeah, throw them out by hand. 40 million. Takes days and days and days.
One of Burns' team takes me to where the oysters begin their lives.
Those black dots, those are, hundreds of thousands of oysters.
Mark Beatman leads the way. In this large room, the baby oysters are nestled in rows of long metal troughs. Coils of tubes bring algae and seawater to nourish the small creatures.
It looks like a little piece of pepper or something. Untrained eye, it's nothing.
In a couple of months, these little pieces of pepper will be thumbnail size, and they'll go to municipal reseeding projects in other townships around the bay, like Brookhaven. And some of them will make their way into laboratories run by scientists like Beth Rabbit.
As a researcher, it's easier to use this unattached oyster than one that's growing flat up tight against another shell.
Rabbit teaches environmental science at Rutgers University. Oysters are her specialty.
People often refer to them as the canary in the coal mine for a marine system. They're more sensitive to things like pollution. So if there are environmental stressors, the oyster will tell you that because it will affect their mortality and their growth.
These animals aren't just indicators of a healthy environment. They're major actors in creating one. As they feed, oysters filter the water, up to 50 gallons a day. Multiply that by billions of oysters, says Rabbit, and you get much cleaner water.
So they will remove all these little particles from the water column, and that will let the light come through, so that light can support plant life, phytoplankton, single-celled plants.
Rabbit's just one of many scientists trying to bring back oysters. She works with New York, New Jersey Baykeeper, a nonprofit organization. 2 years ago, they began to reseed oysters below Staten Island in Raritan Bay, where the oyster population has been almost non-existent for over a century. Her team has put 500,000 oysters into its waters.
We will be going back at probably the end of May to pull up the cages, and we'll be counting and seeing how many survived, what percentage survived.
If the oysters survive, scientists will come closer to understanding how to grow them in bodies of water affected by pollution. But another oyster researcher, Jeffrey Levinton of Stony Brook University, is skeptical.
Once you put them on the real bottom as opposed to in a nice floating cage, there are predators that come in. There's lots of crabs, for example. There's water quality. There's sediment moving around. There's all sorts of problems that come up.
Since the late 90s, there have been dozens of successful projects to reintroduce oysters around Long Island, but it's unclear whether scientists can replicate that success in more contaminated waters around the city. Still, Levinson says, things are looking up for the environment.
Well, the big picture that is on the scale of decades is that the water quality is improving in New York Harbor and New Jersey Harbor.
And better water means good things, not just for oysters. Paula Lem, Columbia Radio News.
Being in the outdoors can be thrilling and terrifying. Last summer, commentator Charlotte Gibson learned that camping can leave a lasting mark.
My boyfriend Sean and I have been dating for almost 2 years. We're kind of opposites. He's a professional whitewater kayaker. I'm not. But when he invited me on his family's annual rafting trip on the Klamath River in California, just weeks before I was going to graduate school in New York City, I was game. A few days into the trip, I hadn't drowned or made a spectacle of myself. In my mind, I was queen of the river. I paddled down roaring rapids, check. Jumped off cliffs with the guys, check. Slept in a tent every night, check. And then the third day rolled around. We hiked up this creek to a waterfall. The sunshine, the natural beauty, the peacefulness. I felt like I finally started to get this whole camping thing. My eyes wandered all around, gazing at the beauty of the great outdoors. And then, out of nowhere, I hit my head on a sharp rock jutting out from the side of the cliff. Blood was everywhere. Sean ran to help me. I couldn't stop crying and hyperventilating. I was scared, but more than that, I was embarrassed. Once I was cleaned up a bit, we debated leaving or just bandaging my cuts at the river. I downplayed how hurt and worried I really was. 2 days later, back at home, I finally had a chance to be alone to examine my wounds. There I was, standing in front of the mirror, looking at this 3-inch gash above my eyebrow and a jagged 2-inch gash below my left eye. I started to cry. I hated the idea that my face was forever damaged from the trip. And then it got worse. A week later, I started to feel really sick. I was vomiting every day, but I didn't think it was related to my injury. When my mom finally dragged me to a concussion specialist, he made me do things like stand on one leg with eyes closed for 30 seconds. Couldn't do it. Stand on both legs with my eyes closed. Nope. Say the months backwards. I started with November. The doctor diagnosed a severe concussion. The only remedy was brain rest. Pretty much do nothing until I healed. But I was going to graduate school in New York City in 3 weeks. How was I supposed to survive if I couldn't even say the months in the right order? At the beginning of the summer of 2014, my biggest fear was if I was going to survive 5 days camping on the river. By the end of the summer, my biggest fear was if I was going to survive all of graduate school at an Ivy League. For the next 6 months, I had migraines and short-term memory loss. I worried my brain would never work the same way again. I have survived and thrived, but that moment on the river is never far from my mind. Each morning, when I look in the mirror, I see 2 scars from the accident. They tell a story of triumph and a story of trauma. They represent my first and possibly last camping trip, and hopefully my first and only head injury.
Charlotte Gibson was invited on her boyfriend's family rafting trip again this summer. She's hoping that this time she won't run into any rocks.
That does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. Thanks for being with us.
Our Commander-in-Chief Ariana Skybell drove the show as executive producer. Senior producer Camille Van Canel made sure we got the best sound on air.
Director Cassandra Bassler flew the studio plane with help of co-pilots Teresa Avila and Miriam Sitz.
Editors Hava Gorari and Gregor Moll were our wordsmith today.
The whole internet community can listen to our show thanks to our webmasters Anjali Sastry and Alistair Gardner.
Congrats to our reporters who came out and brought back the stories you heard today.
Special thanks to our beloved leaders Carrie Donahue, Daniel Alcorn, Rick Carr, and John Dingus. I'm Nardos Mesmer.
And I'm Adelie Pante. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4 p.m. and on WBAI Mondays at 5 a.m. You can download our podcast, find us online at uptownradio.org, and follow us on Twitter at Uptown Radio. Thank you for listening.
Yay! Congratulations!